Hey, and welcome back to another video. And in today's video, we're going to look at how we can use TextField and SecureField in SwiftUI to capture user input and also modify them as well. Sometimes in your application, you may want to capture some user input from your user and use this later on at some point. This is the whole point of TextField and SecureField. So what we're going to do is build a login form with a button that prints out whatever the user has typed in. We'll also look at how we can style our text fields too. And if you want to learn more about buttons, and I actually have a video on this called Buttons in SwiftUI and SwiftUI button styles in iOS 15. So first of all, let's look at the different ways we can create a text field. So we'll create a SwiftUI file called TextField examples. So let's do that now. And let's add in a VStack. Cool. So the first thing we're going to do is just type out text field. And you should see that you have a text field with all the different options. So you can pass in a text field with a localized key and bind to some kind of text. You can also just use a title if you wanted to. Also as well, you can set a prompt for the text field, as well as setting some formatting for the text field as well if you want to as well. So you've got quite a few options here in terms of what you can do. The option that we're going to pick is the one where you can set your title and bind it to some kind of text. So we want to choose the second one here. And then for our title, we're just going to type in name. And then for now, for the binding, we're just going to type and use a constant so it just has some kind of default value. So in order to see this working, let's actually use our TextField examples as the root view for our app. So we go to test project app, we're going to replace our content view with TextField examples, and then I'm just going to run this on the simulator, and you should see now if you tap on a text field that you're able to type in it with your keyboard. Now if you're someone who doesn't have this setting where you can actually use your keyboard directly, what you want to do is go to IO input output, and then you want to set the keyboard to connect to your hardware keyboard. So if you don't have this option selected, what will happen is when you tap on a text field, you'll get the system keyboard like so. So you can either toggle that on or off. Sweet. So what we're going to see now is how we can actually add a prompt to this text view as well. So let's see what happens when we actually add a prompt to it. So we go back to our text field examples. This time we'll add a prompt. And you'll notice something here that when we use our prompt this time, we're not actually showing the text label name. Instead, it's actually using our prompt here to actually display to the user what they should do. So when you're working with prompt, it will actually take priority over the label. Now, what I want to do is actually see how we can use a text field where we actually specify our own custom label. So let's just add in another text field. And if you scroll down, you should see the option here where it has the text, prompt, and label in the initializer. And this text is what we're going to bind to. This prompt is the prompt that we just discussed a second ago. And this label is the label that you would see on the screen. So you can see here, again, even when we specify our own custom label, the prompt still takes priority over the custom label that we've set within our text field. But if I also just delete this prompt from here and just use a label like so, you'll notice that now it's using our text view. So we've spoken about text field, but we actually have another view that is the same as it, and it helps us handle cases like this where if you want to have someone enter in their password, you don't want that to be exposed so they can actually see what's going on. So we can actually use a view called SecureField, which actually gives us this capability. So what we're going to do now is actually just type this out and then add it in. So now we have a secure field, and when you actually create a secure field, you'll notice that the initializers for it are pretty much the exact same as text field, so there's not really anything that's different. The only thing that is different is that if we just run this on the simulator and type in both of them to see what happens, so you'll notice that in the password field, I can see what it is that I'm actually typing in. But alternatively, if I go into the secure field, you'll notice that it actually doesn't expose what I'm typing. So this is really useful when you want to give someone the option to actually type in some kind of sensitive information that you don't want to expose. So we've broken down all the possible values in text field and secure field. So now let's actually look at how we can actually build a login view for simulating login users in. So the first thing that we need to do is actually go into our test project app and change the text field examples back to content view. And what I'm going to do is just stop the simulator from running and then just dismiss this. So now what we want to do is actually define some kind of model for our login form. So let's go into our content view, and within it, we're going to define a struct called user. So the whole purpose of this struct is to capture the input form. The whole point of this struct is to capture the input from our text field and our secure field. So whenever someone actually types in a value, it will store those inputs within these properties. So this is our model for our source of truth. So now let's define a source of truth for our user input by using the state property wrapper. And if this was within your view model, then you want to use the publish property wrapper, which I break down in observable object and publish in SwiftUI. So let's just type this out now. So now what we're saying here is that we're just creating an empty user, and this is what we're going to bind to our text fields. So let's actually build out the UI for our username and password, and we'll use a VStack to group them all together. So what I'm going to do is just build out each individual component in a separate extension so we don't clutter up our UI. So let's actually just break down what we have here. So we've got a private extension, and I've created 3 computed properties here. So if we go through the first one, it's this is the username text view, and we're returning a text field, and this is the label that we're going to show. So this is the username, and then here what we're saying is we're going to bind our source of truth that we define here, user, to the text field's text. So whenever someone types in the text field for this username, it will update this username property. So those two are bound together. And then finally, what I've defined here is a prompt. So the prompt here is username. So this is going to take priority over the label. So if we look at our secure field for our password text view, it's pretty much the exact same, except that this time, rather than us binding the username, we're binding the password. So whenever someone inputs into the password text field, it will update this property within the struct. And then finally, we have another computed property here called submit button, and this is the button that we're going to use to actually print out what someone has typed in, so simulating you sending off the form. So what we want to do now is actually add these components into our UI. So let's actually type this out, and then again we'll just break it down. So one thing I've noticed is that the second text view is username when this should actually be password. So let's just update that now. So that should be right now. So it should be password. And if you actually just look at the body for our content view now, you can see now by actually breaking up our views into computed properties, it's just a lot more easier to read. So you can see at a glance that this is the username, text view, password, and submit button. And if we wanted to directly change those views, we can just go into that computed property and just add in our modifications. So we have our text fields on the screen, but at the moment they're looking a bit bare. So how can we style them? Well, we can use a TextFieldsTyle modifier on our VStack so that all the children that our text field gain the style. So let's do that now. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that all the children that are text fields within this VStack, we're going to give them a text field style of rounded border. So after our padding, we're just going to say dot text field style, and then we're going to say dot rounded border, like so. And now you should realize that your text fields now have a rounded border effect on them, so they're a lot more visible. But we can even go deeper on our text field and specify what kind of content that they hold. So let's see how we can apply this onto our username text field. So on our username text view, what we're going to do is specify the text content type. And if you look at the description in terms of what text content type here, it basically tells the system what type of text field this is. Now, this isn't just a normal text field. This is specifically for username. So if you actually hit dot on the modifier, you'll see that you actually have a load of options which give this text field a description in terms of its purpose. And this also helps out with the system handling stuff for accessibility. But the option that we want is username. So we can actually specify that this is a username text field. And then what we want to do is we want to apply the same thing onto our secure field, except this time, rather than the text content type being username, we want it to be password, like so. Cool. So it's also possible as well that when you're actually working with text fields, that by default, the first letter that you type in is automatically capitalized, and you can also get suggested to you autocorrection. So since the username and password isn't really a sentence, it's more just like a combination of strings that someone's come up with. Let's actually disable these two features by using two modifiers. So as you can see here, I've applied a modifier, disables autocorrection true, onto the VStack. Now you may be wondering, why did I not just apply both of these directly onto both of the text fields? Well, these are two modifiers that both of our views are going to share, so it makes sense to add it onto the parent so that they get applied onto its children. And the reason why we didn't do that with the text content type is because if you look at the type for the text field username and the type for the password, it's actually two different types that we specified. So if you've got modifiers for text fields that are specific to that text field, then it makes sense to apply it onto the actual text field itself. But if you have a group of text fields like we have here and they all share the same kind of styles, then it makes sense just to apply it onto the group of them. So before we carry on, I just want to talk about the auto capitalization. So right now we've set this to none, but if you actually remove this and hit the dot notation, you'll see that you can actually specify when you want the capitalization to start. So you can say for characters, never, sentences, words. So what we're going to do is actually specify a auto capitalization of never rather than none, because none won't actually do anything. So in order to actually see this in our app, let's actually just run this on the simulator and just see what happens. So now on our simulator, if we actually just click on this text field and I just start typing, you'll notice that the first letter is not automatically capitalized. And also as well, if I was to just turn on the keyboard for the actual iPhone, you'll see that I actually don't get any auto corrections, so any suggestions that hey, you're typing in the wrong text. And in our secure field, you can't actually see what the user's typing at all. So this is looking good so far. So now what we want to do is we actually want to print out the values that someone's entered in here when they actually tap submit. I'm just going to reduce the size of this because we're probably going to use this again later. So now what I'm going to do is in our submit button, we want to create some kind of action or function that actually prints to the console. So let's actually add this in now. So now we have another private extension with this function called submit. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to actually use this in line in the button. So let's just delete this part of the button here. And then we'll add the parentheses. And then we'll just type out action. And then for our action, we'll just call submit like so. So now if we actually rerun this, if I just increase the size of this, so if I was to just type in here some text, and then if I was to hit submit, you'll see that it actually prints out the username, tons, and the password, pass. So that's working all good. But we have an issue here, and our keyboard is actually still on the screen. So when we actually tap submit, we actually want to dismiss this keyboard because we don't actually need this on the screen anymore, because we've finished typing in what we want. So how do we handle this? Well, there's two ways of handling this depending on the OS that you're supporting. So if you need to support iOS 14 and below, then you actually need to handle this yourself manually by using a bit of UI kit code. So let's actually see how we can handle this in iOS 14 first, and then we'll also add in some code so it automatically handles this for iOS 15 as well also. So the first thing we're going to do is create an extension, and within that extension, we're going to have a function that will resign any text fields that are currently active on the screen. So let's type it out and then we'll break it down. So what we're saying here is that for the UI application, we're going to send a notification to the system to resign the first responder. And what this essentially means and does is it just posts a notification to the app to say any text fields that are currently active, don't make them active anymore. So what we need to do now is that when someone actually taps on the button, we actually want to call this function to dismiss the keyboard. So let's actually add this into our submit function. So we actually dismiss the keyboard after we printed the user input. So all we need to do here is that just type out dismiss keyboard. Cool. And the reason why I've done this as an extension on Vue is because this is an extension on Vue, we can now access this dismiss keyboard function from any view. So let's say if we were to go back to our TextField examples file, within here, if we wanted to, we could actually see that function here, as you can see, dismiss keyboard. Okay, so now what we're going to do is actually run this on the simulator and then see what happens. And now, when I start typing, when I hit submit, you'll now see that we get our information printed into the debug area, and also the keyboard now dismisses. This does work and it is fine for anything that's iOS 14 and below, but for iOS 15 we actually have a new property wrapper that actually makes life a lot easier, so we don't actually need to use this UI kit code. We can actually just directly use property wrappers within SwiftUI, and this property wrapper is called focus state. So in this video, we're not going to explore everything to do with focus state, but we'll look at how we can use it to simply remove focus from a text field. And in future videos, we'll go into more detail about managing complex forms using focus state. So first of all, what we need to do is actually create a source of truth for our text field in terms of whether it is focused or not. So at the top here, below our state, we're just going to type this out. We have this new property wrapper here called focus state, and this allows us to attach a state to a text field so we can actually make it active or resign it. So we can either resign it so that it's not active anymore. And you can see here that we declared the type Boolean because input focus can either be true or false, and it doesn't actually have a default value because no text field is actually going to be active just yet. If you wanted to though, within your onAppear, you could set a text field to be active as soon as a screen opens up, but we'll discuss and look into that in a future video. So what we want to do now is actually use this what we want to do now is actually use this input focus property on our actual text fields individually. So let's go into our private extension where we declared our text views, and then what we're going to do is actually attach our input focus to the text fields using a binding. So this modifier .focused literally allows you to control whether the text field is focused or not. So right now we're just saying here that if the input focus is equal to true, then this text field is focused, or this one will be focused. So either one of these two text fields will be focused. So now we need to write a condition in our submit button for iOS 15 devices to only set focus to false so that the keyboard dismisses when we actually are finished submitting. So in order to do this, what we're going to do is use an available attribute to check whether the user is on iOS 15 or below. So I'm just going to add this in now and then we'll break it down. What we're saying here is that if the user is on iOS 15 or anything higher than that, then we're going to run the code in here, or else anything below iOS 15, so 14, 13, it will actually execute this dismiss keyboard function. So right now, what's going to happen is we're going to set the input focus to false, so whichever one of these text fields is active and focus, it will actually resign and remove the keyboard on the screen. So let's just run this now, and we're on iOS 15.2. So now, if we actually just start typing, I'm just going to put any old nonsense in here, and if we hit submit, you'll see now that on iOS 15 specifically, because we set the input focus to false, it now dismisses our keyboard. So one thing to note as well is that we're able to also add in actions via buttons on top of our keyboard by using the toolbar. So what we're going to do is actually add in a button on top of our keyboard called done, and when you tap on this, it will actually dismiss the keyboard. So in order to do this, we're going to need to add in the toolbar modifier. So let's scroll back up to the top, and we're going to apply this toolbar modifier onto our VStack. But before we do that, let's just do a bit of refactoring. So because we're now going to have code that dismisses the keyboard in two places, let's actually separate this logic out here into its own function. So I'm going to create a brand new function called Resign Keyboard, and then we're going to call this function after we finish printing. So now after we finish printing to the console, we will resign the keyboard like so. But now what we're going to do is use this same function for the button within our toolbar. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll break it down. Okay, cool. So now within our toolbar, so what we're saying here is that we're going to apply a toolbar, and the placement for this toolbar item group that we specified here is going to be on the keyboard. So this is going to be on whenever you tap on a text field, and if there is a keyboard on the screen, it's going to add this toolbar item group that we're defining here above the keyboard. So we're going to go into a bit more detail about toolbars and toolbar item groups in another video called Toolbars in SwiftUI. But for now, we're just going to simply discuss how it works with a keyboard. So now this will add this on top of the keyboard. And what we said here is we're going to add a spacer so it pushes our button to the right hand side. And then finally, we have a button here where the action is going to call that function we created before called Resign Keyboard. And we're going to have text here saying done. So let's actually just run this and see what happens. So now if I tap on this text field, you'll notice that our toolbar has been applied and placed on top of our keyboard like we specified here. We've got a spacer here which is then pushing our button to the right hand side, and then we have our button here done with the action Resign Keyboard. So if I hit the done button here, you'll see that our keyboard dismisses, and if I tap it on this, it dismisses as well. So what you could do if you wanted to is you could actually have a load more buttons inside of here that do different things, and these will just be placed on top of the keyboard whenever it's visible on the screen. So one final thing I want to show you is how we can actually customize this keyboard here. And when someone taps on the password text field, this here will actually be a blue button that we'll use to also indicate that you can actually submit a value, and we can actually pick up that value by using a modifier. So what we're going to do first of all is actually customize our password text field by giving it the system submit button. So this improves our UX and makes it clear to the user that this is going to perform an action. So you may be wondering why the password field and not the username field, and this is because our username field isn't the last input that someone must fill in. So let's apply this now by adding a submit label onto our password text field. So you scroll down to your password text view, and then after focus, if you just type submit label, and then we just type done. So now if we just rerun this, you'll notice that when you tap on username, it says return, but when you tap on password, it now says done. So now we actually have a done button that we can actually listen to actions for, and it also gives the user some kind of visual feedback that, hey, this is going to do some kind of action. It's not the same as the username. So what we want to do now is we actually want to add in the ability for someone to be able to submit this whole form without needing to actually tap this button at all. So by adding in this modifier, what this is going to do is actually check this submit label and trigger whatever code that we want. So let's go back up to our VStack and after our toolbar. So we're going to use the on submit modifier. So let's just type this out. So we're going to say on submit. And you'll see that you have quite a few actions here. So you have one where you actually have a closure, and you actually have one where, again, you have the same action closure again. But the one we want is we want the off, because we want to submit this form when a certain action is triggered. So if you hit the last one with the off, and if you hit dot here, you'll see all the possible options that you can use. But what we want is we want to use the text option. And then finally, within the action, we're just going to use the actual submit function in line of this action. Cool. So what we're saying here is that on submit of the text fields, we're going to execute the submit function that we declared below here. So let's actually just run this and see what happens. And now we just type in here. What we can do is actually hit done. And as you can see, when we hit done, it prints out what it is that we actually inputted into our text fields. Okay, cool. So that's everything in this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd love to hear your feedback in the comment section below. Also as well, if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a thumbs up, as well as subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell for updates for whenever I release a new video. That's everything from me. I'll catch you all in a bit. Deuces.